It was autumn in Eldridge, Iowa, and the cold nights were starting to settle in. As a newcomer at Eldridge High School, the old library immediately caught my attention with its aura of mystery and promise of hidden stories. On my first day exploring, the quiet atmosphere and shelves filled with ancient books seemed to whisper secrets with the slightest breeze. I spoke with Mrs. Hensley, the librarian, who, with a slight smile, hinted that she knew some real spooky stories. She told me about Elizabeth Morrow, the library's founder, whose spirit, according to rumors, never left the building. Stories of books moving on their own and nighttime whispers began to fill my imagination with an uncontrollable curiosity. In the days that followed, this curiosity only grew. Each visit to the library gave me a peculiar chill, as if someone was always watching. I decided that I needed to find out more. Conversations with older students and old records only fueled my obsession with the real-life haunted experiences that seemed to revolve around that library. One night, I gathered my courage and prepared to stay late, hiding between the shelves after closing time. The nighttime silence in the library was different, heavy, as if every shadow and every whisper of wind carried a secret. That was when I began to hear, faintly, the sound of pages being turned in a distant room where no one was present. These sounds guided me through dark corridors, and in the gap between a shelf, I saw something that made my heart stop, a silhouette passing through the shadows, gliding silently over the worn carpet. It was just a preview of what the night held, and every second inside made me question whether I was alone or accompanied by something beyond my understanding. That first night was only the beginning. With every investigation, every moving shadow, I knew I was getting closer to understanding who or what kept the library alive after dusk. The truth, I felt, was right there, hidden in the yellowed pages of the books Elizabeth Morrow loved so much. The night wore on, and in the silent library of Eldridge High School, every shadow and every whisper seemed to take on a life of its own. I was there, following the mysterious sounds of moving books and footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The feeling was palpable, something or someone still inhabited that place. Armed with a flashlight, I decided to explore the school's old archives. The lights flickered, casting shadows all around, intensifying the already tense atmosphere. Then, among the dusty files, I spotted a female figure in the distance, standing as if waiting for me for decades. I slowly approached, my heart pounding so loudly it seemed to echo down the hallway. The figure, a female silhouette draped in cobwebs, pointed to a book. Upon closer inspection, I saw it was a record about Elizabeth Morrow, the library's founder. She was holding a page that spoke of a personal diary that had never been found. Intrigued and with fear knocking at the door of reason, I decided I needed to find that diary. It could be the key to understanding the strange phenomena in the library. With the figure disappearing like a shadow at dawn, I began my frantic search for the diary, rummaging through every corner of that ancient space. Every book taken from the shelves seemed to whisper old secrets as I delved deeper into the library's history. The night dragged on, and the feeling of not being alone only grew. At any moment, I expected something or someone to emerge from the shadows, revealing the mysteries that had been kept for years. This search led me to a forgotten corner of the library, where a small, old chest lay hidden. My heart raced with the possibility of having found the diary, the heart of the true and terrifying stories surrounding that place. Carefully, I opened the chest, prepared to discover what Elizabeth Morrow had left behind. The tension was palpable as I opened the old chest, an object that seemed to hold decades of secrets and untold stories. Inside, I found a pile of yellowed documents and, carefully wrapped in faded cloth, Elizabeth Morrow's diary. My heart quickened as I touched the worn leather cover, feeling the weight of history in my hands. With the diary open, the pages revealed elegant and detailed handwriting. Elizabeth had written about her life, the founding of the library, and, more intriguingly, her truly terrifying paranormal encounters with entities she believed to be the original owners of the books she collected. She described how these apparitions started as mere curiosities and, over time, became clear communications. She firmly believed that her mission was to protect the books and the stories they contained, even after death. As I read, I heard a soft sound, almost a melody, coming from the shadows of the library. It was as if Elizabeth herself was there, watching and perhaps approving of my discovery. The environment was charged with an energy I couldn't explain, a mix of awe and fear. Elizabeth's story detailed how she had prepared the library to be a sanctuary not only for knowledge but also for the spirits of those who had loved books during their lives. She believed that by protecting the library, she was also ensuring peace for the spirits that resided there. It was a fascinating and disturbing perspective that cast a new light on the strange events I had witnessed. Inspired by her dedication, I decided I needed to do something to honor her legacy. With the diary in hand, I turned to the task of restoring and protecting the library, making it a place of respect and tranquility, as Elizabeth had wished. This meant not only caring for the books but also acknowledging and respecting the stories and presences surrounding them. The following days were filled with the work of cataloging the old books, repairing the shelves, and, in a symbolic gesture, reorganizing the archive section where I had found the diary. Each step seemed to strengthen the connection between me and the spirit of the library. Sometimes, late at night, I could swear I heard a whisper of thanks in the air, a confirmation that my work was restoring more than just the physical, but also the spiritual. As I shared Elizabeth's story with other students and teachers, I noticed that the atmosphere around the library began to change. Fear and mystery gave way to respectful curiosity and a new appreciation for the place. The Eldridge High School library was no longer just a repository of books, it was a living memorial to a woman who dedicated her life and beyond to protecting history and the souls who loved it. This rescue of her memory and mission brought unexpected peace. The shadows receded, the light stopped flickering, and the air became lighter. It was as if Elizabeth, finally satisfied that her sanctuary was being cared for, could rest. I, on the other hand, felt that my journey there was just beginning. The library became my refuge, a place where the past and present meet, and where every book has a scary and wonderful story to tell. The spirit of the basketball court. I've always loved basketball. Since I was little, the court was my sanctuary, the place where I could forget the world and focus only on the sound of the ball bouncing on the floor and the distant echo of my footsteps. When I moved to Nashville, this passion became even more important. New to the city, the school, and without close friends, I sought refuge on the basketball court at East Nashville High School whenever I could. But nothing could have prepared me for what was about to happen. It was a cold October night, the kind where the dry leaves on the ground seemed to whisper secrets to the wind. I had decided to stay late to practice my moves, perfect my shots, and honestly, escape a bit from the loneliness I felt. The court was completely empty, which made me comfortable to train. But soon I realized there was something different about that night. As time passed, I began to feel a strange presence. It was as if the air around me had grown heavier, filled with an energy I couldn't immediately identify. I tried to ignore it and kept playing, but a shiver ran down my spine when I distinctly heard the sound of a whistle cutting through the silence. I stopped, looking around, expecting to see someone. But the court was as empty as ever. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but then, I heard something even more disturbing. The sound of a ball bouncing, but it wasn't mine. It came from the other side of the court, in the darkest corner where the lights didn't reach. I swallowed hard and, hesitantly, started walking toward the sound. Each step made my heart beat faster, and my breath grew shorter. That's when I saw him. A boy, apparently my age, dressed in an old school uniform, standing there, playing alone. He didn't seem to notice me at first, so I stood still, watching, trying to understand what was happening. When he finally looked up and saw me, I felt a chill run through my veins. His eyes were filled with sadness, a pain that seemed to transcend time. "Why did you leave me?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. I was speechless. It made no sense. I had never seen him before and certainly didn't know him. Before I could respond or react, he disappeared, as if he had never been there. The shock paralyzed me for a few seconds, but I quickly regained control and ran for the court exit. When I finally reached the door, I was out of breath, with my heart racing, and I wondered if it had all been real. The next day, I couldn't get the image of that boy out of my head. Who was he? Why did he appear to me? I decided to investigate. I began discreetly asking about the school's history, looking for some clue about what had happened. That's how I learned, from one of the older teachers, that decades ago, a star player on the school's basketball team named Tyler had collapsed during a crucial game. He was adored by everyone, and his sudden death cast a shadow over the school that never completely lifted. As I investigated further, I discovered that many believed Tyler never left the court. There were reports of sightings, whispers about a presence that still played there, as if unable to leave the game he loved so much. I became obsessed with the idea that maybe, somehow, I could help Tyler find peace. But how? That night, I returned to the court. This time, I was prepared. I brought a basketball with me and a renewed determination. I placed the ball in the center of the court and, with a firm voice, said, "Tyler, you're not forgotten. This is your game. Keep playing." Then, I sat on the bleachers, waiting. The court was bathed in an almost deafening silence. But I wasn't afraid. I was determined to see this through. The minutes dragged on, and for a while, nothing happened. But then, as if responding to my call, the ball began to move. First, a slight bounce, then stronger until the ball was bouncing on its own, as if an invisible player was shooting hoops. The scene was both fascinating and terrifying. Tears filled my eyes as I watched, feeling that somehow Tyler was communicating with me, showing that he was still there, trapped between the world of the living and the dead. In the days that followed, something changed at school. The court, once feared by some, began to attract the curiosity of students. Many began to report sightings of Tyler, always playing, always practicing the sport he loved so much. But instead of fear, these encounters generated a strange kind of reverence. It was as if Tyler had become a living, or almost living, legend, an indelible part of the school's history. The experience transformed me in a way I hadn't expected. I came to understand that some souls might remain bound to what they loved in life, unable to move on. And maybe they just need to be remembered, respected, so they can finally find peace. For Tyler, basketball was everything, and I wanted him to know that even after all these years, he was still remembered. One night, I decided to organize a small tribute to Tyler. I told his story to some classmates and teachers, and together, we held a game in his honor. It was a simple event but filled with meaning. With every free throw, with every basket, we felt as if we were connected to something bigger, something that transcended time. After the game, I left a brand new basketball on the court as an offering. When I turned to leave, I swear I felt a gentle breeze pass by me, almost like a touch of gratitude. Since that day, I've never seen Tyler again, but I know that somehow, he found the peace he was searching for. And I found a new perspective on life, death, and the power of the real stories we carry with us. The East Nashville High School basketball court was never the same, and neither was I. I came to believe that, somewhere, Tyler is still playing, but now, finally at peace. After that tribute game for Tyler, things began to change at school. The court, once a place that carried a sense of melancholy, now felt lighter as if Tyler's energy had finally been released. The students who had once hesitated to practice alone at night started using the space more often, and the court became a place where everyone felt welcome. A few weeks later, while I was cleaning out my locker after practice, I found something unexpected. A small hair ribbon, the kind players wore in the 70s, carefully folded and left there without explanation. I knew it wasn't mine and didn't belong to anyone I knew. I picked up the ribbon and, in a moment of understanding, realized it was Tyler's final gift, a symbol that he had finally found his place of rest. It was a reminder that even after death, our stories and memories can continue to touch the lives of those who remain. The Choir of Lost Souls. When I moved to the small town of Glenbrook, I didn't expect much. The new school, Glenbrook High, seemed like just another old, gloomy building housing bored students and tired teachers. But there was something about that school that stood out, something that intrigued me from the very first day, the infamous Forbidden Corridor. It was a forgotten section of the building, hidden on the lowest floor, and almost every student had a story to tell about it. And, of course, these stories varied from scary encounters to supernatural whispers. I've always been the curious type, so naturally, this corridor became an obsession. No one knew exactly what had happened there, but they said that decades ago, there was an accident involving a student who was never the same again. The corridor was closed shortly after, and the few who dared to venture there swore they would never do so again. Some spoke of a cold presence, a shadow moving between the walls, while others swore they heard footsteps and distant laughter. It didn't take long for my curiosity to overcome my fear. I needed to see it with my own eyes, to feel what terrified people so much. So, on a rainy afternoon when the school was almost empty, I decided to go there. The lights flickered weakly as I approached the corridor. The atmosphere seemed to change as I got closer to the blocked entrance. The air was heavy, and the silence was almost deafening. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I was about to make a big mistake. But curiosity won out. I pushed open the old, creaking door, and the sound echoed through the empty corridor. The first thing I noticed was the change in temperature. The air was freezing, like I had stepped into a refrigerator. Every step I took made the floor creak in a way that seemed to echo throughout the school. The walls were covered in old graffiti, but what caught my attention were the framed photos, old, faded by time. They showed old school classes, but there was something strange about them. The students' faces seemed blurred, smudged, as if time had tried to erase them. I was about to turn and leave when I heard a sound coming from the end of the corridor, a sound that made my heart race. It was footsteps, soft, almost imperceptible, but there, in that quiet, it was as if they were approaching quickly. My initial instinct was to run, but something made me stay. Maybe it was the same impulse that brought me there. As I continued, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was as if the eyes in the photos followed my every move. Finally, I reached the end of the corridor, where an old, heavy door was slightly ajar. Behind that door was a small, dark room. I entered cautiously, and the first thing I saw was a table covered in old, dusty papers. But what caught my attention was an old notebook with a worn leather cover. When I opened it, I realized it was a diary. The pages were filled with notes and drawings made by a student named Margaret. She described feelings of sadness, loneliness, and fear. Fear of something or someone who was following her in that corridor. Suddenly, the lights started flickering uncontrollably, and the door behind me slammed shut with a bang. I was paralyzed, trying to understand what was happening. That's when I felt a presence. It wasn't something I could see, but I knew I wasn't alone. The air grew even colder, and I began to hear whispers as if ancient voices were trying to tell me something. The whispers blended together, creating a cacophony that left me dazed. With trembling hands, I continued flipping through the diary. Margaret repeatedly mentioned a figure that followed her, a girl who seemed to materialize out of nowhere, always at the end of that corridor. She called her the Shadow. According to Margaret, this shadow was a student who died in a tragic accident in that corridor, and since then, she wandered there, trapped between worlds. Suddenly, the pages of the diary began to move on their own as if someone or something was urgently flipping through them. The words began to blur, with letters smudging in strokes that looked like they were made by a trembling hand. The light stopped flickering, and for a moment, everything went completely silent. But that's when I heard it. A single, clear, and terrifying whisper in my ear, "Leave." Terrified, I ran toward the door. The corridor seemed to stretch out infinitely as I ran, as if the space itself was distorting around me. When I finally managed to open the door and get out, the heavy air seemed to release me, and I collapsed, breathless and in shock. I knew I had found something that shouldn't have been disturbed. That night, back in my room, I couldn't shake the cold from my body. Margaret's words echoed in my mind. For days, I tried to forget what had happened, but the shadow seemed to follow me, as if the shadow from the corridor had clung to me. I avoided the school as much as I could, but I knew the only way to end it would be to find out what really happened to Margaret and the shadow. I decided I needed to tell someone, so I went to the school's history teacher, one of the few who had been there long enough to maybe know the truth. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher, and after a long silence, he confirmed the story. There was indeed a girl who died in that corridor many years ago under mysterious circumstances. Her name? Margaret. That sent a chill down my spine. The diary I had found, the presence I felt, everything started to make sense. The shadow wasn't just a hallucination or a story to scare freshmen. She was real, and somehow, I had awakened something that should have been left in peace. The teacher warned me never to go back to that corridor, saying that some places are better left forgotten. Since then, I've avoided any mention of the forbidden corridor. But even now, years later, I can't forget what I saw and felt. The nights are the worst when darkness takes over and the shadows seem to come alive. I still wonder if by opening that diary, I released something that had been dormant. And I still hear, from time to time, a whisper in my ear, telling me to leave. The shadow, it seems, never really left me. The Ghost of the Science Lab. As far back as I can remember, I've always loved flipping through yearbooks. The photos, the memories, the messages scribbled during the last week of school, all of it had a nostalgic aura that made me feel part of something bigger. When I received my own yearbook in my senior year at Jefferson High School, it was no different. Sitting in the living room, I spent hours going through the faces of my classmates, reminiscing about inside jokes and shared moments. But that night, something unusual happened. Something I still can't forget. It was a typical night, like so many others. After dinner, I sat in the living room and started flipping through the yearbook. I was home alone, and the silence was comfortable, broken only by the sound of turning pages. Everything seemed normal until I got to the senior section. One photo immediately caught my attention. Among so many familiar faces, there was one I couldn't identify. It was strange because I knew everyone in my class. The photo in question showed a boy with a slightly blurred face, as if the camera had moved at the moment of the shot. I thought it was just a printing error, but the more I looked at it, the more that image bothered me. There was something unsettling about the boy's eyes, or rather, the lack of them, since the blur seemed to be concentrated right there. Curious, I tried to remember if I had ever seen that face before. I asked some friends, but no one remembered a student with those features. This only fueled my obsession. How could someone we didn't remember be in our yearbook? I decided to dig deeper into the matter. If there was something strange about that photo, I needed to find out what it was. The next day, I went to the school library to investigate. I found some old yearbooks and started flipping through them, looking for any clue about that boy. After hours of fruitless searching, I finally found something. In a yearbook from 1992, there he was, with the same slightly blurred face, but now it was possible to see a name below the photo, Jonathan Pierce. The name didn't ring any bells, but what I discovered next sent a chill down my spine. Next to the photo, there was a small note that said Jonathan had died shortly before that year's graduation. The cause of death wasn't clear, but the words, mysterious circumstances, were penciled in, as if someone had added that detail later. I felt a shiver run down my spine. How could he be in my yearbook years after his death? I decided to go back home, and for the first time, flipping through the yearbook was no longer pleasant. Something was deeply wrong. As I examined Jonathan's photo again, the room seemed to fill with a heavy energy, as if I was no longer alone. A faint murmur echoed through the room, and for a second, I thought I heard my name being whispered. Looking around, I saw nothing, but the discomfort persisted. That night, I tried to forget what had happened, but the events didn't stop there. I was awakened in the middle of the night by a strange sound coming from my desk. I got up, still groggy, and noticed that the yearbook was open, with the page of Jonathan's photo exposed. Worst of all, his face was now even more blurred, almost unrecognizable. From that moment on, strange things started happening. Objects moved on their own, lights flickered for no reason, and I constantly felt like I was being watched. The whispers, which were rare before, became more frequent, especially when I was near the yearbook. That boy seemed to be trying to communicate with me, but I didn't know what he wanted. I needed answers. I talked to my grandmother, who always believed in paranormal things, and she advised me to find out more about Jonathan's death. Maybe if I understood what happened, I could help him find peace. With this idea in mind, I returned to school and began asking the older staff about him. Most didn't know anything, but one of the janitors, a lady who had worked there for decades, finally told me the truth. She remembered Jonathan, and the story she told was even more disturbing than I expected. Jonathan was a quiet boy who didn't stand out much. However, shortly before his death, he started behaving strangely, talking about seeing things no one else could see. The other students began avoiding him, and rumors about him spread. Then, on a cold winter night, he was found dead in his home, with no apparent explanation. Some said it was suicide, but the details were never clarified. I returned home with this new information, but it didn't bring the relief I expected. On the contrary, it seemed to have awakened something. That night, the whispers became screams, as if Jonathan was desperate to be heard. I then decided to do something that I still don't know if it was the right choice. I talked to him. I sat next to the yearbook and said out loud that I knew who he was, that I was sorry for what had happened, and that if he needed help to find peace, I would do what I could. The scream stopped, but the feeling of being watched became even more intense. It was as if Jonathan was there, beside me, waiting for something. That night, while I slept, I had a vivid dream where I was at school, walking through dark corridors. I saw Jonathan in the distance, always just out of reach. He seemed lost, searching for something or someone. I woke up in a cold sweat, with a single phrase echoing in my mind, "Remember me." I woke up determined not to run anymore. If Jonathan wanted to be remembered, I would do that. The next morning, I went to school with the yearbook in hand and sought out the principal. I told him everything that had happened, and despite his skeptical expression, he allowed me to organize a small tribute to Jonathan. I invited some friends, and at the end of the day, we gathered in the school courtyard, where I talked about Jonathan's story, about how he shouldn't be forgotten. As I spoke, a gentle breeze passed over us, and for a moment, I felt a peace I hadn't felt before. I knew Jonathan was there, listening. After the ceremony, I returned home and, for the first time in weeks, slept peacefully. The next day, when I went to pick up the yearbook, I noticed something different. Jonathan's photo was clear as if the blur had disappeared. He was smiling like any other student. From that moment on, things returned to normal. The whispers stopped, the lights no longer flickered, and the feeling of being watched disappeared. I knew that Jonathan had found the peace he was looking for. I still keep the yearbook in a special place, as a reminder that sometimes lost souls just want to be remembered so they can finally move on. The secret of the canteen basement. I've never been the type of person who believes in ghost stories. To me, the unexplained always had a logical explanation, something that could eventually be understood. But that was before I discovered the basement of the canteen at Harrison High School in Detroit. A place I didn't even know existed until then, but one that changed the way I see the world forever. It all started on an ordinary afternoon. I was in the canteen with some friends when I overheard a curious rumor. One of the old janitors mentioned, without meaning to, that there was a basement right beneath where we were, a place that hadn't been used in decades. He said it was a small space, abandoned since the 1930s, and that, according to him, it held secrets that should remain buried. Being the curious person I am, that immediately caught my attention. In the following days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The idea of a forgotten basement right beneath our feet fascinated me. I started investigating, asking the older staff, but most avoided the subject, saying there was nothing there. However, one of them, a janitor named Joe, confirmed the place's existence. He told me that the basement had been used for anatomy classes decades ago before it was closed off after an incident that no one wanted to talk about. That only fueled my curiosity. So, one afternoon when the school was almost empty, I decided to look for the entrance to the basement. I was alone, which gave me more freedom to explore. I remember every detail of that moment, the smell of food in the air, the distant voices of the few students still around, and the growing feeling that I was about to discover something important. Finally, I found a metal door at the back of the canteen, almost hidden among old boxes and cleaning supplies. It was locked, but with a little force and an improvised wire, I managed to open it. The air that rose from below was heavy, damp, and carried a smell of mold and something I couldn't immediately identify. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity was stronger. I grabbed a flashlight I had brought with me and started descending. The stairs creaked under my feet as I went down, and the sound seemed to echo endlessly. When I reached the bottom, I was surprised to see that the basement was bigger than I had imagined. There were narrow corridors, lit only by the faint light of my flashlight, and old doors that seemed not to have been opened in years. The atmosphere was suffocating, the silence disturbing, and the air was so cold that my hands began to tremble. I walked through the corridors, feeling the damp floor under my feet, and started exploring the rooms. The first room I entered was small, with wooden benches covered in dust and old dissection instruments. There were glass jars on the shelves, still with faded labels, but what caught my attention the most was an old metal table in the center, where it seemed someone had been dissected decades ago. As I examined the room, a feeling of discomfort began to take over me. It was as if something was watching me, something I couldn't see but could clearly feel. I decided that I had seen enough and was about to leave when I heard a sound coming from one of the doors at the end of the corridor. It was a low sound, almost a moan, that echoed through the darkness. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound to a door that was heavier than the others. It was slightly ajar, and with a mix of fear and curiosity, I pushed it open slowly. The room I found was larger, with several metal tables lined up, but what made me freeze was what was in the center. An old stretcher, with worn leather straps, and above it, a large mirror hung from the ceiling, reflecting the stretcher below. The sound continued, clearer now. As I approached the stretcher, I saw old rust stains mixed with something that looked like dried blood. Whatever had happened there, it wasn't just a simple anatomy class. There was something macabre about that place, something that made every fiber of my being scream for me to run. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut with a bang. The sound reverberated through the walls, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. My flashlight began to flicker, and for a moment, I was paralyzed with fear. The sound of footsteps echoed in the room, but I was alone. Or at least, that's what I thought. I felt a presence beside me as if someone was there, invisible, watching my every move. The footsteps grew closer, and I felt a cold touch on my shoulder. I turned abruptly, but there was no one there. Just the emptiness and the darkness. The flashlight flickered once more, and for a fraction of a second, I saw something reflected in the mirror above the stretcher. It was a figure, indistinct but definitely human, standing behind me. Fear took hold of me, and I ran toward the door. Fortunately, the door opened easily, and I ran through the corridors, up the stairs as fast as I could. When I finally returned to the surface, the fresh air had never felt so good. I slammed the metal door shut, trying to block out anything that might have followed me back to the real world. My thoughts were a mess, trying to process what had just happened. In the days that followed, I tried to forget the basement of the canteen, but something had changed. I began to hear strange sounds at night, like footsteps and whispers that seemed to come from underground. Objects in my room moved on their own, and the feeling of being watched never left me. I knew that somehow, I had brought something with me from that place, something that shouldn't have been disturbed. One day, I decided to go back to school to talk to Joe, the janitor who had told me about the basement. But to my surprise, he had disappeared. No one knew where he was, and those who knew him said he simply left town without warning. This only added to my discomfort, making me question if he knew more than he told me. As time went on, the situation only got worse. The voices became clearer, the footsteps louder, and the feeling of being watched more intense. I tried seeking help, but no one believed me. They said it was just my imagination, the product of irrational fear. But I knew it was real. I knew there was something in that basement, something I had awakened. In an attempt to find a solution, I went back to the basement, this time with a friend, to try to seal the place once and for all. But when we got there, we found the metal door sealed with thick, rusted chains. It looked like someone, or something, had tried to block the entrance from the inside. My friend suggested we leave everything as it was and never return. And that's what we did. From that day on, I avoided the canteen, even avoiding passing near the entrance to the basement. But the nights remained disturbed, the whispers and footsteps never completely ceased. Even now, years later, I still have nightmares about that place. Nightmares where I'm trapped down there with something I can't see but know is there, always lurking. I still keep the flashlight I used that night, but I've never turned it on again. Perhaps, on some level, I'm afraid of what it might illuminate. I've realized that some doors are better left closed. And some places, no matter how tempting, should never be explored. The mystery of the second floor. I never imagined something so strange could happen in a small town like Willow Creek. I grew up here, where everyone knows everyone, and life is pretty quiet. But that tranquility was shattered during my senior year at Willow Creek High School when a simple photography class led me to an experience that I still can't explain. It all started when Mr. Collins, our photography teacher, gave us a special project. He wanted each of us to choose a place in town to photograph, something with an interesting history or personal significance. Since I've always liked abandoned places, I chose the old paper factory on the outskirts of town. It was a place everyone avoided, but I thought it could make for some good photos, with all that decaying atmosphere and the somewhat eerie environment. That afternoon, I grabbed my camera and headed to the factory. The sky was overcast, creating the perfect lighting for the photos I wanted to take. When I arrived, I noticed the place was even more deserted than I remembered. The windows were broken, and vegetation had taken over much of the structure. I entered through the rusty gate, trying not to think about the stories I'd heard about the place being haunted. As I explored the inside of the factory, I started taking some photos. The light streaming through the broken windows created interesting shadows, and the silence was almost absolute, except for the distant sound of birds and the rustling of leaves. Everything seemed normal until I began to feel a strange sensation, as if I was being watched. I tried to ignore it and kept photographing, but the feeling only got worse. I decided to go up to the second floor, where the offices were. The stairs creaked under my feet, and dust rose with every step. When I reached the top, I saw that the corridor was full of locked doors, except for one, which was slightly ajar. My instincts told me not to go in, but curiosity won out. I opened the door and entered the room. The room was small, with a single window overlooking the back of the factory. There was a desk in the center, covered in old, faded papers, and a chair knocked over on the floor. It looked like no one had been in there for decades. I took some photos, capturing the atmosphere of abandonment. That's when I noticed something strange on the wall next to the window, a dark mark, as if something had burned there. I moved closer to get a better look, and when I touched the wall, I felt an intense cold, very different from the temperature in the rest of the place. It gave me goosebumps, and that's when I heard a faint sound, like a whisper, coming from somewhere behind me. I quickly turned around, but there was no one in the room. My heart started beating faster, and I felt it was time to leave. As I descended the stairs, the sound of the whisper seemed to follow me, getting closer and closer. Quickening my pace, I almost ran toward the exit and only stopped when I was finally outside. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down, and convinced myself that it was all just my imagination, perhaps exacerbated by the strange atmosphere of the place. I went back home and started reviewing the photos I had taken. Everything seemed normal until I got to the images from the second floor. The photos of the room with the mark on the wall were disturbing. There was something in them that I hadn't noticed at the time. A dark figure, indistinct, appeared in one of the photos, as if it was standing by the window, watching me. I was shocked and couldn't stop staring at the photo. The figure was almost invisible, but it was there, a humanoid shadow that seemed to emerge from the wall itself. I showed the photo to some friends, but no one could explain what it was. I decided to take the image to Mr. Collins, hoping he could provide a technical explanation, maybe a defect in the camera or something like that. When I showed the photo to Mr. Collins, he was silent for a long time, studying every detail. Then, he looked at me and asked where I had taken the photo. When I told him it was in the old paper factory, he seemed surprised. That's when he told me something I didn't know. Many years ago, before the factory closed, a fire broke out on the second floor, in the office where I had been. One of the managers died there, trapped by the flames. The story gave me chills. The mark on the wall, the cold sensation, the whisper, and now the photo. Everything started to make sense, but in a way, I didn't want to believe. Mr. Collins advised me not to go back there and suggested I keep the photo in a safe place, far from where I slept. He seemed serious, and his expression made it clear that it wasn't just a suggestion. I followed his advice. I printed the photo but kept it in a locked drawer, out of sight. However, since that day, I began to feel a strange presence around me, especially at night. It was as if something or someone was watching me, waiting. Or maybe demanding something from me. Sometimes, I heard whispers in the dark, similar to those I heard in the factory. Time passed, but the feeling never completely disappeared. I avoid talking about it, but I know that figure in the photo wasn't a defect, nor was it a common shadow. It was something more, something that shouldn't have been there, but somehow, it was still trapped in that place. Now, whenever someone mentions the old paper factory, I feel a chill run down my spine. I haven't gone back there, and I have no intention of doing so. Some things should stay where they are, undisturbed. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel like that shadow is watching me, waiting for the right moment to reappear. And when the darkness seems deeper and the silence heavier, I can almost swear I hear that faint whisper again, coming from somewhere distant, yet so close, as if the factory were still there, right beside me, hidden in the shadows. If you like this true horror story, you can't miss 8 horrific true school lockdown stories, compilation. Watch the video, click on the video appearing here in the card, or search for the previous video on this channel. And, of course, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments if you've ever had a paranormal experience too. Stay brave and see you in the next scary story.